Alright, look, I'm thinking a lot about next year's iPhones, mainly because I'm constantly thinking to myself, what the heck are they gonna do? Because I'm loving the iPhone 12 mini, by the way. I've gotten comfortable with it, I've gotten used to it, the battery life isn't even an issue for my everyday work life anymore, and I keep asking myself, like, okay, if we just had a major design upgrade this year, then that means next year has to be minor, so what's gonna be the big flagship feature that Apple tries to get everybody to upgrade for? They can't brag too much about 5G. The display quality just got a huge boost, so I imagine they can't even do anything overwhelmingly noticeable with the display. I doubt they'll even shrink the notch, and even if they did, I doubt most people would notice. So sounds like Touch ID might be next year's flagship feature. Let's begin. So in case you weren't aware, Apple was recently polling some people who were buying iPhone 12 units. 9to5Mac was reporting on this, saying that a few of their readers were sending them screenshots and information about some of these poll questions Apple was asking their own customers, which is not a new thing. Apple has done it before. Most recently, they were actually polling people what they thought about the charge brick that was included with their iPhone. Asking people, you know, how much do you really use that charge brick? And does your last iPhone still have the charge brick in the box? We're never really gonna know what the results of those polls were, but all we know that did happen is that Apple decided to remove the charge brick shortly after they sent out those polls. So if here we are at the end of 2020 coming into 2021 and Apple is sending out polls asking about how people feel with Face ID. Do they like Face ID on their phone? Are they uncomfortable with Face ID on their phone? And if you say you're uncomfortable with Face ID, they actually give you a bunch of options saying, you know, why don't you like Face ID? Is that you prefer Touch ID, or Face ID is unreliable, or you don't like how Face ID doesn't work when laying flat on a table, or you wear glasses sometimes that Face ID doesn't work with? The way I saw this poll going out, which is really interesting because as far as I'm aware, Apple has never polled their user base on how they feel about Face ID, is that Apple's trying to figure out if they need to just make Face ID better than before, or if they need to implement Touch ID. Probably if a bunch of people end up voting in that poll saying that they prefer Touch ID, Apple's going to consider bringing it back. Because when I think about all the potential features rumored for next year, it's all very tech community based stuff, okay? So there's you and me watching these types of videos that are thinking, well, 120 hertz on the Pro iPhones, that's a big deal, right? I'll upgrade for that, but we all know average consumer doesn't notice or care about that type of thing. And of course, it'll only be on the Pro iPhones, the standard iPhones that most people buy. Of course, those are going to stay at 60 hertz. I'd be very surprised if Apple actually wanted to up those to 90 hertz, but given the battery life on the 12 and 12 mini, I doubt they're interested in pursuing that. So outside of that, what else do we got going for them? Larger camera sensors, which those larger camera sensors are already being used in the 12 Pro Max, and based on the reviews, we can tell that the differences are not super noticeable. It's like slightly more detailed, but definitely not something most people would notice or even care about. We've already got night mode on the front-facing camera, on both the rear-facing cameras, so the ultra-wide camera might get a little bit more crisp, so yay. Okay, slight camera improvements, maybe some battery life improvements thanks to the A15 chip, so everything seems pretty incremental. And when it comes to getting people to upgrade to the new iPhone, I think Apple's gonna want something a bit more flashy that they can brag about, and in my opinion, Touch ID is probably the thing the average consumer would notice the most. That's something we interact with dozens of times a day, maybe hundreds for some of us. We unlock our phones constantly, and if there's a huge demographic out there that is uncomfortable with Face ID and is sticking with older iPhones because they prefer Touch ID, then bringing that to next year's iPhones might just be the last thing Apple can implement to get people to actually upgrade to next year's iPhones. Now, before you get super duper excited, I don't necessarily think that means putting Touch ID in the display. Main reason I'm skeptical of that is that, yes, Apple has had patents for in-display Touch ID for 4 years now, coming up on 5, moving into 2021, and I covered it in the past back when my tech channel was first starting out. The leaks about Touch ID in the display on an iPhone were ping-ponging back and forth non-stop, and one day it would be like, yes, the next iPhone will have Touch ID in the screen. Next day it was like, actually no, just Face ID. So because of all of that back and forth, and because I've been reading reports that next year's iPhone will have Touch ID and then it doesn't, and then next year's iPhone will have Touch ID and then it doesn't, I'm just super duper skeptical, which is why the only reason I'm talking about it now is because because Apple's actually pulling people to see if they prefer Touch ID, which means they're at least thinking about it. And also, the different situation here is we have now seen Apple develop iPads with Touch ID, but no home button. So there's a little bit of a middle ground now. Of course, the iPad Air 4 is rocking Touch ID in the power button, which, looking at the flat sides of the iPhone 12, we can now kind of see, yeah, I think it wouldn't be terribly complicated for Apple to add if adding Touch ID with this new sensor that probably required new research and development, new manufacturing methods, because Apple had never built Touch ID like that before. However they designed it, however they mass produced it, it must be cheaper than Face ID implementation, right? Because otherwise they just would have put Face ID on the iPad Air 4. But they chose not to, either because it saves them money, or maybe they wanted to separate the iPad Air from the Pro because they were worried they would have too much in common. The truth is probably a mixture of both, so I imagine it is cheaper and they wanted some differentiation from the Pro lineup. But for the record, I don't think Apple's ditching Face ID on the iPhone, okay? Calm yourselves. Some of you were probably thinking, oh, this means smaller notch, right? Literally, it's like the notch is all anyone wants to talk about these days. It's not gonna matter at the end of the day. No one's gonna care. But either way, especially in the age of the pandemic when there's tons of people wearing masks and a lot of people were thinking, maybe the COVID stuff will be done in a few months. But here we are coming up on a year and cases in the US at least are all-time high. Anyway, we're not talking about that today. That's real world crap. Point being, there's a lot more people wearing masks. So having Face ID be your only biometric is a bit of a bummer. So in my opinion, if Apple wanted a simple, scalable, and affordable way to put Touch ID back on the iPhone, putting it in the side button similar to the iPad Air 4 is probably the best way to do it. And of course, you will still have Face ID. So don't feel like that's being replaced. Apple is way too big a fan of memojis and that AR crap for them to actually start ditching the sensors on there and going back to Touch ID after all the great things about Face ID they said, especially for their flagship iPhones. If in the future Apple wants to make a Touch ID only iPhone that's cheaper, like a SE3 or something like that, that I could see happening. But when it comes to the OLED models and the 12S or the iPhone 13, whatever they end up calling it, that I could see Touch ID being one of the main things Apple likes bragging about. So now, even if you're wearing a mask, you can unlock your phone with a biometric, and I've even seen some of you talk about how you want super secure mechanisms where to unlock your iPhone, you're gonna need your fingerprint and your face to register, which would just be whole new levels of security. I don't think they need to go that crazy, and I do agree it's a bit weird because Apple's typically not the kind of company to want to have two biometrics on a single device. Apple is typically the kind of company to be like, no, Face ID good, nothing else works, everyone's using the new way, which is why I understand skepticism about these rumors. But if you think about, okay, maybe next year's iPhones don't have Touch ID, what is there going to be to upgrade for? What is Apple going to brag about on stage? The colors are really, really good this year. We actually fixed the red iPhone 12. Hey, that's not a bad idea. I think a lot of people would upgrade for that if they could actually get a product red iPhone 12 and not product pink. And the 120 hertz thing is definitely a tech community nitpicky thing. It's not something most people are going to notice or care about. So it's those main entry-level iPhones that I think need something to warrant the upgrade for a lot of people. And I think that they've already developed Touch ID for the iPad on the side button. So why not just throw that over and call it a day? The other slight bad news that I didn't want you guys to be too alarmed about is in the polls Apple was asking people about. They were also curious if you're using the included cable in the box. So it sounds like they might actually want to ditch the last accessory in the iPhone packaging, which honestly, given how upset everybody was that they were shipping USB-C to Lightning cables with the iPhone, I kind of am fine with that. Just throw that cable out of there. Probably aren't going to use it anyway. Would likely kill off all the e-waste complaints. But what do you guys think of Apple adopting Touch ID and Face ID on the next iPhone? Would that get you to upgrade? Does that sound like the perfect iPhone to you, or does Touch ID mean nothing? Feel free to let me know. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.